G virus didn't start in a laboratory. It started with a little girl locked in a cell, experimented on for years, and a discovery umbrella made inside her body that they were willing to do anything to get their hands on. Tonight, we're going through the complete timeline of the G virus. If you enjoy, a like and a subscribe goes a long way, and every single one means a lot to me. The progenitor virus was isolated on December 4th, 1966, by James Marcus, Oswell Spencer, and Edward Ashford. They found the pathogen inside the sacred flower discovered in the Kajuju region of West Africa. At a cellular level, the virus aggressively rewrote genetic code and hyper-accelerated mutation, while the later T virus was a crude weaponization of this code meant to cause decay. The raw strain held much evolutionary potential. It was designed to fully rewrite human biology, to forge an immortal race of superior gods. The Ndapaya tribe had lived near the ancient ruins for generations. Their tradition, simple and brutal. Their hunters would eat the flower, and whoever survived the trial would lead the tribe. Most died, but those who didn't came away faster, stronger, and seemingly resistant to the decay that claimed everyone else in time. The tribe stumbled onto something ancient without fully understanding what it was. They didn't need to understand the science. They just needed to survive the process. The 3 researchers arrived in West Africa with the specific intention of finding what the tribe had been using for centuries. They weren't doctors in a humanitarian sense. They were men with a shared vision and a private program they hadn't disclosed to any government. They found the flower and they isolated the virus. By early December, they confirmed that what they held was an organism capable of rewriting the code of any cell it entered. Spencer had been thinking about eugenics long before he ever set foot in Africa. He immediately understood that he held the foundation of a program meant to redesign the human race entirely. He didn't care about medical breakthroughs or treating diseases. He saw a future where he could decide who survived and who evolved. A vision that would eventually poison the next 30 years of human history. Part 2. The T virus and its limitations. James Marcus stabilized the progenitor code by splicing it with leech DNA, creating the T virus that William Birkin subsequently inherited. However, the virus possessed a critical, massive flaw. Its genetic mutations were entirely random, uncontrolled, and unstable. It caused severe brain necrosis, making its biological weapons mindless, decaying, and tactically unreliable. Birkin grew intensely frustrated by this limitation. He wanted to engineer a precise, self-stabilizing pathogen that could force a host to adapt without destroying their higher cognitive faculties. The T virus killed the host's mind, leaving a shambling corpse that followed simple commands. It was a failure as a true evolutionary tool because it destroyed the intelligence it was meant to improve. Birkin knew that to build a superior human, he had to keep the brain functional. He spent his years in the training facility trying to refine the viral strands to prevent the necrosis. He failed to find a stable line that didn't rot the host from the inside. This limitation drove Birkin toward his own research path. He stopped viewing the T virus as the final goal and started seeing it as a stepping stone. He needed a viral agent that could work with the host's nervous system instead of tearing it apart. He began to believe that the key wasn't in the leech DNA Marcus used, but in a completely different kind of mutation process. The frustration colored his interactions with his peers. He looked at the other researchers as if they were blind to the obvious failure of the project. He believed he was the only one in the company who could see past the immediate weaponization goals to the true evolutionary future. He was right, but he was also becoming dangerous in his obsession. Part 3. William Birkin in 1978. In 1977, a 15-year-old William Birkin arrived at Umbrella's training facility as an elite prodigy, under the direct, eccentric mentorship of James Marcus. Birkin was introduced to the foundational laws of viral recombination. His academic ambition was already vastly larger than his age suggested. He openly mocked his peers, despised corporate limitations, and grew entirely obsessed with surpassing Marcus's work, resolving to find a viral breakthrough that would grant him absolute dominance over Umbrella's scientific hierarchy. Birkin didn't see himself as a student, but as a future director. He spent his nights reading the private journals of the founders, mapping out the mistakes they had made in their early research. He believed the company was stagnating under Marcus's cautious direction, wasting precious resources on leeches when they should have been focusing on true cellular rewriting. He treated the laboratory like his personal domain, pushing his experiments until the early morning hours. His obsession alienated him from the other researchers, but he didn't care about their opinion. He wanted recognition from the board, not friendship from his colleagues. He began to keep his best data in a secret folder, shielding his progress from Marcus's oversight. He knew that if he wanted to control the future, he had to keep his own secrets. The facility became his entire world. He didn't have hobbies or interests outside of the glass and the slides. Every successful mutation he witnessed was another piece of evidence that his vision was superior to the board's stagnant goals. By the time he turned 17, he was already leading the most promising research track in the entire facility. In 1988, the Arklay laboratory team, led by a young Albert Wesker and William Birkin, injected a high-tier biological asset named Lisa Trevor with the experimental parasite. The parasite was designed to nest in a host's brainstem to grant tactical intelligence, but Lisa's body had spent 30 continuous years absorbing every viral strain Umbrella possessed. Her unique, resilient anatomy did something biologically impossible. Instead of succumbing to the parasite, her immune system aggressively attacked, dismantled, and absorbed the organism, fusing its parasitic properties directly into her mutated cellular matrix. Lisa wasn't a normal subject. She'd been trapped in the mansion for decades, subjected to an endless battery of chemical injections that would have killed a dozen ordinary humans. She was a living graveyard of abandoned projects, her tissue a chaotic archive of failed experiments. The researchers watched her through the reinforced glass, terrified by how she could survive the lethal doses that were meant to liquefy her organs. She was the company's most expensive mistake. Birkin noticed the change in her behavior as the parasite vanished into her system. She didn't become an intelligent soldier as the developers had intended. Instead, she became an erratic, violent predator that possessed a terrifying physical durability. She could survive gunfire and impact, her cells repairing the damage within minutes of the trauma. She was a biological paradox that shouldn't have been breathing. The team couldn't manage her anymore. Her presence in the facility grew into a liability, forcing the staff to seal off her containment wing entirely. Birkin continued to monitor her from his remote desk, fascinated by how she'd survived the parasitic fusion. He saw the potential for a breakthrough that would change everything, a path to a true evolutionary leap that didn't require the T-virus rotting line. Part 5. Something impossible in Lisa's blood work. While reviewing Lisa's routine blood work following the failed execution, Birkin isolated an entirely new, unmapped biological signature. Deep within her altered cellular structure, a primitive, hyper-adaptive viral strain had spontaneously evolved out of the absolute annihilation of the parasite. In the seconds it took Birkin to analyze the data, his unhinged genius understood exactly what he was looking at. A pathogen that could aggressively adapt to threats in real time, completely independent of the T virus lineage. This wasn't just a mutation of the old strain. This was a completely new creature living inside her blood. Birkin realized that Lisa's body hadn't just survived the experiments, she'd created something better. The new virus had stabilized the chaotic strands, forcing them to work in a coordinated way that the T virus could never achieve. It was the answer to every question he'd asked since he arrived at the training facility. He spent the next night in the lab, rerunning the sequencing on his own private console. He had to be sure. The results were the same every time. The virus was active, aggressive, and perfectly synchronized with Lisa's cellular growth. He knew that if he could extract this strain, he could rewrite the future of the company. The danger of the discovery wasn't lost on him. He knew that if he brought this to the board before he finished his analysis, they would take it away, just like they'd taken the leech research from Marcus. He decided to keep it secret for now. He began planning the next phase of his career from his small desk, his ambition growing as he stared at the glowing monitor. Part 6. The G virus concept. Birkin immediately drafted his master research thesis, naming the discovery the G virus. He established a revolutionary theoretical framework based on directed evolution rather than random mutation. While the T virus caused passive, destructive decay, G was designed to actively rewrite a host's genetic structure in response to external trauma, creating an aggressive, self-correcting biological matrix. Birkin firmly believed his notes were describing the birth of a terrifying new kingdom of sentient life. He didn't want to just create a weapon. He wanted to create an entity that could handle its own survival in any environment. The virus wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to force the host to be better, stronger, and more resilient than the previous version. It was an aggressive solution to the fragility of the human body. He called it his masterpiece, the work that would finally secure his legacy. The thesis detailed the mutation process, explaining how the virus would force the host to build new features as the situation demanded. He described an evolutionary loop that would never stop, an endless cycle of rebuilding and upgrading until the subject reached an apex state of physical perfection. It was a cold, efficient vision of the future. He didn't care about the pain it would cause the subject. He presented the initial data to a few selected assistants, but he kept the master keys for himself. He knew the potential was too large for the company to handle without his direct control. He saw himself as the god of this new world, the only person who could correctly interpret the viral language. The theory was sound, but the application would be his darkest work. Part 7. Birkin's proposal to Spencer. Birkin submitted a highly classified research proposal directly to Oswell Spencer. Reading the file, Spencer's eugenics obsession was instantly reignited. He recognized a critical factor that the hyper-focused Birkin had not yet fully grasped. The G virus was a flawless tool to achieve global genetic purification and corporate immortality. Spencer bypassed all standard administrative boards, granting Birkin absolute, unlimited corporate funding, total operational isolation, and zero executive oversight to weaponize the project. Spencer saw the value immediately. He'd been looking for a way to perfect his own vision for decades. But the T virus had consistently failed him. This new proposal promised a result that could finally override the limitations of natural selection. He approved the funding without a second thought, knowing that Birkin was the only mind capable of realizing this dark potential. The deal was finalized in a private meeting at the mansion. Birkin walked out with the unlimited budget and a new laboratory project that would take him away from the main company directory. He had exactly what he wanted. He didn't realize that Spencer saw him as nothing more than a temporary tool, a brilliant mind who would eventually be discarded once the virus was finalized. The isolation was exactly what Birkin requested. He didn't want the board's interference or the company's rules hindering his experiments. He wanted a clean laboratory where he could push the virus into the next stage without any moral oversight. He spent the next year building his team and moving his assets to the new site beneath the city. Part 8. What G was actually designed to do. Birkin's idealized goal was the creation of a G-human, a perfected, hyper-evolved species that could retain human intelligence while gaining complete genetic immortality and real-time cellular adaptation. However, the biological reality of what he was actually building was a parasitic apex predator. The virus possessed an aggressive, volatile drive to continuously mutate the host body far past the boundaries of human symmetry, trading baseline humanity for raw, unhinged physical supremacy. The goal was to create an entity that could decide its own evolution, but the virus took control instead. It forced the host to change not into a better version of themselves, but into a stronger, faster, and much more dangerous organism that ignored the original blueprint. Birkin saw these mutations as successful tests, ignoring the fact that his perfect subjects were losing their ability to reason. He believed the intelligence would stabilize in the later stages, but the data suggested the opposite. The more the virus adapted the host, the more the human mind faded into the background. It was a trade-off he was willing to accept, convinced that the raw power was more valuable than the human consciousness he was erasing. He continued the trials regardless of the cost. The end result was a creature that couldn't communicate or follow orders. It could only fight and survive. Birkin labeled these as minor errors, problems he could fix with a few adjustments to the chemical lines. He didn't realize that the virus's primary instinct wasn't to refine the host, but to propagate its own code at any cost. Unlike the T virus, which spreads easily via fluids or bites, a primary G virus host can only propagate its lineage through asexual reproduction by forcing a localized embryo down a target's throat. This mechanism requires an incredibly specific, narrow window of matching genetic compatibility. If the target's DNA matches, the embryo fuses seamlessly with their cells. If the host genetics are non-compatible, the target's immune system suffers catastrophic cellular rejection, causing a horrific abdominal rupture that births a mindless, independent genetic abortive monster. This reproductive drive was the most unpredictable aspect of the virus. Birkin hadn't anticipated the host would prioritize creating new life over its own tactical security. He watched as his subjects abandoned their guard posts to seek out compatible hosts, their instincts overriding the corporate programming he had installed. It was a biological compulsion that he couldn't stop. The failures were ugly and loud. The non-compatible hosts didn't survive the process, their bodies tearing apart as the embryo forced its way into the light. The abortive monsters were mindless, hostile entities that attacked anything they encountered, including the researchers. Birkin spent weeks trying to stabilize the genetic match, but the virus kept rejecting the candidates. He decided that the only way to perfect the propagation was to find a host with an extremely close genetic match, like a direct relative. This realization shifted his focus from general weaponization to a much more focused and dangerous objective. He began tracking his own family as potential assets, his personal detachment allowing him to rationalize the risk. Part 10. The Alexia Interference. In 1981, the emergence of 10-year-old child prodigy Alexia Ashford as the chief researcher of Umbrella's Antarctic base severely fractured Birkin's fragile ego. Driven into a manic state of scientific rivalry, he began working at a reckless, hyper-accelerated pace to reclaim his status as Umbrella's premier mind. The extreme academic pressure made him vastly less careful with safety containment protocols, permanently souring his relationship with Umbrella's corporate auditors as he began viewing his research data as his exclusive personal property. He couldn't stand the idea of a girl, a child of the founding family, surpassing his life's work. He saw her research as an amateur project, a waste of resources that he could have used to refine the G virus. He spent his days in the lab trying to outpace her milestones, cutting corners on the safety gates and bypassing the secondary containment checks to save time. He wanted to be the first to deliver a finished weapon to the board. The rivalry ruined his professional standing. He stopped attending the company's executive meetings, choosing instead to focus entirely on the laboratory's output. He grew paranoid, believing that the auditors were trying to leak his data to the Antarctic facility to help Alexia. He locked down his terminal, refusing to share his progress with anyone but his wife. The stress made him prone to sudden, explosive arguments. He blamed his assistants for every delay, viewing their standard safety checks as intentional sabotage meant to favor the Ashford girl. By the time he moved to the new facility beneath the city, he was entirely convinced that the company was turning against him. He was ready to burn the whole thing down. Part 11. Moving to Nest. To ensure absolute secrecy from rival corporate spies, Spencer relocated Birkin's entire team to Nest, a multi-million-dollar, state-of-the-art underground laboratory facility constructed directly beneath the Raccoon City municipal grids. Given an absolute mandate, Birkin entered a state of complete social exile. The work permanently eclipsed everything else in his life. He slept in his labs and ignored civil society, completely withdrawing from his parental duties as the perfection of the G virus became his singular god. The new laboratory was a technological wonder, featuring automated containment suites and dedicated server arrays that monitored the viral sequences around the clock. Birkin didn't have to report to the board for months at a time, the isolation granting him the freedom he'd demanded. He treated the lab like a bunker, reinforcing the exterior doors against any external observers. His wife followed him into the deep site, leaving their daughter in the care of hired tutors. They grew disconnected from the normal world, their lives entirely defined by the temperature settings of the incubators and the growth rates of the subjects. They weren't a family anymore. They were two scientists living inside an industrial tomb. They rarely saw the sun, their clocks set to the timing of the facility's power cycles. The isolation gave him the cover he needed to prepare for his ultimate move. He knew the company was getting closer to discovering his secret defection plot, so he kept his research data on encrypted drives that he could carry with him. He planned to deliver the virus to a government buyer, knowing it would be the only way to escape Spencer's grasp. He had everything in place. Part 12. The 12 Years at Nest. For 12 continuous years, Birkin ruled Nest as a dictatorial chief scientist, commanding a massive skeleton crew of high-level researchers. His brilliant wife, Annette Birkin, acted as his secondary lead assistant, handling the complex mathematical mapping and genetic sequencing models needed to stabilize the viral strands. After over a decade of continuous human trials and massive resource drainage, the G virus was officially completed in the late summer of 1998. The laboratory grew into a self-sustaining city beneath the streets. They developed specialized air filtration systems and independent power grids to maintain the volatile environments needed for the G subjects. The staff lived in the facility, their lives governed by the strict, cold rules Birkin set to ensure his project remained uncompromised. Anyone who questioned the ethics was quietly dismissed or transferred to a lower site. Annette was his only trusted confidant. She managed the day-to-day operations while Birkin focused on the high-level genetic code. They were a terrifying team, their combined intelligence accelerating the project toward the final stage in a timeline that had once seemed impossible. They weren't just researching, they were rewriting the laws of biology in the dark. The final breakthrough happened in August of 1998. The virus stabilized in a petri dish, its sequences locking into a permanent, aggressive loop that Birkin recognized as the end of the research cycle. He'd done it. He'd created the king. He kept the news off the company's main network, telling the board only that the project was still progressing through standard testing phases. Part 13. What the completed G virus could do. The finalized G virus was a biological terror. If injected into a living host, its cellular matrix would trigger an endless loop of 5 distinct progressive mutation stages, systematically erasing human anatomy to build armored bone plating, multiple independent ocular tracking cores, and a secondary set of clawed appendages. The host's higher consciousness would be completely overwritten by an absolute, feral reproductive drive to locate a compatible genetic blood relative, making it the most volatile biological discovery in human history. The mutation stages weren't just physical changes. They were a systemic deletion of the person that had been there before. The virus consumed the host's brain tissue to fuel the development of the new combat features. By the final stage, the creature wasn't a thinking entity anymore, but an unstoppable engine of propagation that needed to find a compatible host to survive. It was the absolute end of the subject's humanity. Birkin didn't see the loss of the mind as a defect. He believed that the power granted in the later stages was a sufficient reward for the deletion of the consciousness. He was fascinated by how the ocular cores could track movement with military precision, his data logs praising the efficiency of the killing machine he'd built. He had lost his perspective, his admiration for the mechanics blinding him to the monster he'd produced. The virus didn't just adapt to damage, it sought out new ways to inflict it. It was an aggressive, adaptive organism that thrived in the trauma of the combat zones. Birkin kept the samples in the inner vault, his finger on the glass as he planned his final move. He wasn't going to surrender his masterpiece to Spencer. Part 14. Spencer wants the virus immediately. The moment the data streams confirmed completion, Spencer issued a formal corporate order, demanding Birkin immediately surrender all mastered G virus vials and relocate to Umbrella's European headquarters. Birkin's internal spy networks flagged a terrifying reality. Spencer planned to have him permanently executed or locked away the moment the transfer was finalized to secure exclusive corporate ownership. Having anticipated the betrayal, Birkin had already resolved to execute a total defection. He knew how Spencer operated. He had watched the founders go through the same cycle of exploitation and disposal, his mentor Marcus being the most prominent example. He wasn't going to be the next victim of the company's cold administrative board. He began preparing his exit strategy, securing the research files and preparing the vials for transport. The order was meant to be a simple executive transfer, but it was really a death sentence. Birkin responded to the formal request with a polite, stalling message, claiming he needed a few more weeks to stabilize the transport conditions for the volatile samples. Spencer didn't buy the lie. His own security team already tracking Birkin's private communication channels. The stage was set for a confrontation. Birkin knew that the company would eventually send an extraction squad if he didn't follow the orders, so he accelerated his talks with the government procurement agents. He had one chance to escape the lab with his work. He was ready to burn the bridges before Spencer could cross them. Part 15. The US military contact. Birkin entered secret, high-level negotiations with a specialized Black Ops faction of the military. Birkin offered them exclusive ownership of the G virus and the complete nest blueprints in exchange for absolute federal immunity, permanent political asylum, and a heavily armed extraction squad, genuinely believing a sovereign state would safeguard his legacy better than a ruthless pharmaceutical corporation. He was naive to think the government wouldn't treat him as an asset to be exploited, but he was desperate enough to take the gamble. The negotiations were handled through a secure terminal, Birkin using a coded interface to manage the deal. The agents promised him a safe house, new identity papers, and a life outside the reach of the company's assassins. He told them he could provide the only working sample of the virus in existence. It was a deal he thought would finally make him the center of the global power structure. The military wasn't concerned with the ethics of the virus, only its strategic value as a deterrent against other corporate syndicates. They agreed to his terms, sending an extraction team to the city limits on the date of the scheduled transfer. They were prepared to strike the lab and pull him out before the company's security teams could mobilize. Birkin didn't realize that the military was already infiltrated by Umbrella's own intelligence officers. His communications were being intercepted by the same board he was trying to flee. He was walking into a trap that he had helped build through his own arrogance. Part 16. How Umbrella Found Out. Birkin's defection plot was completely compromised by deep cover corporate moles embedded within the military command loops. The classified extraction documents were intercepted and routed directly back to Spencer's executive desk. Enraged by the treason, Spencer bypassed all standard legal channels, giving his elite Umbrella Security Service tracking division exactly 24 hours to deploy a lethal kill squad to Nest to secure the assets by any means necessary. The company didn't issue a warning or a request for clarification. They sent a strike team, their orders clear: retrieve the case and eliminate the scientist. Spencer didn't tolerate betrayal, and he certainly didn't let a valuable patent walk out of his front door. He monitored the team's progress through a remote console, his cold eyes fixed on the map of the city. The moles were high-level officers who had worked with Birkin's handlers, the betrayal complete and absolute. Birkin was oblivious to the breach, his mind entirely focused on the government extraction plan. He believed he was outsmarting the corporation, while in reality, he was simply delivering his work to the company's own agents. The deployment of the team was a total surprise to the facility guards, who weren't authorized to let anyone into the inner research sectors. The company didn't care about the protocols, their team cutting the security gates to reach the laboratory. By the time Birkin realized the threat, the strike force was already through the primary blast doors. The trap was perfect. Orchestrated shutdown of his entire life's work. Birkin tried to encrypt the mainframe, but the USS units were already hacking his terminal codes from the exterior control nodes. He was isolated, his exit plan dismantled by the company he thought he was leaving behind. He had nowhere to run. He realized the scale of the failure when the security grid died. The lights went black, the emergency batteries failing to ignite. and the sound of heavy boots echoed down the cold stone hallways. He was caught in the middle of his own web, the company arriving to take what he believed was his own property. Part 17. The USS Alpha Team Briefing. The elite USS Alpha Team, commanded by the cold corporate operative Hunk, was deployed into the Raccoon City underground grid. Hunk's team was explicitly ordered to secure the pristine G-virus samples and eliminate all high-level resistance, but they were kept completely in the dark regarding the parasite's real-time mutation capabilities. Armed with heavy automatic weapons and custom duralumin transport cases, Alpha Team slipped into the city's vast sewer system on the evening of September 22nd, 1998. Hunk was a ghost in the company, a operator who never asked questions or hesitated during a mission. He led his squad through the dark pipes with mechanical precision, his tactical headset feeding him the coordinates for the nest entrance. They were the company's best, a lethal team that had handled high-risk extractions in the past. They treated the laboratory as just another target. The briefing had been brief and clear. Secure the samples, neutralize the defectors, and get out before the local police could respond to the noise. They were given the layout of the internal security system, which the company had already bypassed. They expected light resistance, a simple task for a squad trained for combat. They descended into the damp tunnels, the water rising above their boots as they moved toward the laboratory bulkhead. The air in the sewers was heavy and foul, but the team didn't break their formation, their focus locked on the mission. They were ready for whatever they would find behind the steel doors. Hunk checked his primary firearm, the steel frame cold in his hands. He was a professional who prioritized the objective above all else, his loyalty to the company's bottom line absolute. He led them through the maintenance corridors, his movement fluid and quiet. They arrived at the laboratory entrance just as the alarm cycle began. The mission was a straightforward corporate cleanup. They didn't know they were hunting a man who had built a monster, or that their survival was entirely dependent on their ability to get out before he woke up. They were the company's elite, entering a room that was about to turn into a slaughterhouse. Part 18, the standoff in Nest Hunk's Alpha Team, successfully breached Birkin's high-security inner laboratory, cornering the frantic scientist as he packed his master research vials into a secure silver case. A tense standoff ensued across the linoleum floors. Hunk demanded the case, but Birkin flatly refused to surrender his life's work, screaming that the virus belonged to him. The high-stress conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before a panicked USS operator's finger slipped on a trigger, unleashing a sudden wall of lead. Birkin scrambled behind his equipment, his eyes wide with a manic terror as the bullets shredded his clean room gear. He'd lost everything, his deal with the government and his dream of an independent future, all gone in a single moment of aggression. The USS team didn't care about his desperate pleas or his scientific ego, their orders calling for the immediate retrieval of the case. They fired in a rhythmic pattern, suppressing his cover until he had no room to move. The laboratory was a nightmare of shattered glass and sparks, the advanced technology failing under the hail of submachine gun rounds. Birkin tried to reach for a secondary terminal, but a burst of fire tore the keyboard from his grip. He was cornered, his life's work sitting on the table, surrounded by soldiers who only saw it as a product. The standoff was over. Hunk walked forward, his weapon level as he looked at the bleeding scientist. He wanted the case, the objective clear and defined. He didn't see a human being, he saw a target that had been designated for removal. He was a machine following a script, his hands steady as the rest of his team moved in to secure the facility. Birkin watched them approach, his realization of the inevitable defeat showing in his face. He'd built the most advanced pathogen in the world, and now he was going to die on the floor of his own vault. He reached out, his hand shaking, as he looked at the samples in the case. He had one last chance. The shots rang out again, the impact forcing Birkin down into the tile floor. He felt the cold touch of the metal floor against his chest, his vision darkening as the team closed the distance. The mission was going exactly as the board had ordered. The cleanup was almost finished. Part 19. Birkin's shot. Birkin was riddled with multiple high-caliber submachine gun rounds, collapsing violently into his equipment. The USS team secured the master duralumin case, packed a handful of secondary T-virus vials, and immediately executed an operational retreat toward their sewer extraction point. William Birkin was left bleeding out on the floor of the multi-million-dollar laboratory he had spent 12 years building, his lungs filling with blood as his physical life reached zero. He was discarded like waste. He lay in the dark room, his blood spreading across the floor in a wide, dark pool. He listened to the boots of the soldiers walking away, their mission successfully completed. The lab was silent now, the only sound the flickering of a broken ceiling light that threatened to extinguish. He was alone, his body failing, and his mind spiraling into a final, desperate rage. He remembered the early days in the training facility, the lessons from Marcus, and the dream of a new evolution. It felt like a lifetime ago. All of it had been for this, a lonely death in a cold room. He didn't want to die for a company that had betrayed him. He wanted to survive. He wanted to show them what they had done. His hand searched the floor, his fingers tracing the cold metal of the desk where his backup vials were stored. He was a scientist until the end, his instinct for preservation overriding the trauma of the bullets. He found the secondary case, its lock already popped from the earlier gunfire. He saw the G virus. He looked at the syringe inside, the green fluid glowing in the dim light of the emergency displays. It was his creation, his child, the only thing he had left. He understood that injecting it into his dying body would be the end of William Birkin, but it would also be the beginning of something that would never stop. He moved his hand, his muscles shaking, as he prepared the injection. The laboratory was dark, the only sound the ragged, wet breathing of a dying man. He drove the needle into his chest, the fluid entering his blood. He felt a sudden, massive surge of heat, a fire that felt like it was consuming his very soul. The work wasn't finished. The work was just beginning. Part 20. The injection. In his final seconds of fading human consciousness, driven by a manic desire to survive and execute absolute revenge, Birkin reached for a single, salvaged experimental vial of the G virus. He slammed the syringe directly into his chest, unleashing the raw pathogen into a dying body. This choice triggered a catastrophic biological anomaly, because the virus entered a body whose cells were already suffering from fatal systemic trauma. Its evolutionary expression became hyper-violent and distorted, completely bypassing the idealized G-human matrix to create a feral monster instead. The injection didn't follow the clean, textbook lines he had drafted in his thesis. It tore through his dying cells, rewriting his anatomy while he was still conscious. He felt his bones crack, the calcification process immediate and brutal as his skeleton forced itself to expand. It wasn't the perfected evolution he had dreamed of, but a frantic, ugly scramble to keep his heart beating for one more minute. The virus didn't just work with his current layout, it deleted it. He watched as his right arm swelled, the flesh bubbling and popping as it formed a new, massive appendage. The pain was beyond anything he had ever felt. a total destruction of his physical identity. He didn't care. He welcomed the change. He wanted to be the nightmare they feared. The lab equipment tipped over as he pushed himself up, his center of gravity shifting with every beat of his heart. He couldn't think in human sentences anymore, his brain already losing the battle with the viral code. He felt an intense, focused hatred toward the soldiers who had left him to die. They were his only concern. He stood in the darkness, the creature that used to be a man ready to walk out of the lab. The G virus had arrived, and it was angry. The entire facility wouldn't be enough to contain the rage of the monster. He took his first step, his heavy claw tearing a deep groove into the laboratory floor. The process of the G virus was a total deletion of the man Birkin had been, turning him into a vessel for the pathogen's primary directive. He was a tool of his own creation, a living warning of what happens when you play God with code you don't fully understand. He turned toward the door, his eyes locked on the scent of the soldiers who had shot him. The mutation didn't build itself gradually. It announced itself in a single, catastrophic second. The G virus, already saturated through Birkin's dying tissue, used the adrenaline spike of his terror as a chemical ignition point, converting the electrical charge of his panic into the first engine of reconstruction. His right arm was the initial site, because that was the limb closest to the injection point in his chest. The virus followed the path of least cellular resistance outward from the heart, and the arm was the nearest terminus. The skin split along the forearm first, not tearing but unzipping, the dermis peeling back in clean strips as the underlying musculature expanded at a rate that should have been physically impossible. The bone lengthened by approximately 30 centimeters in under 4 seconds. The calcium deposits thickening into a dense chitinous armor that was simultaneously bone and something else entirely. A hybrid lattice that the virus was building according to a blueprint nobody had written down. The eye that erupted from his shoulder was not decorative. It was fully functional within moments of its emergence, its optic nerve threading backward through the new musculature to connect to a secondary neural cluster that the virus was assembling beside his original spinal column. Birkin's brain didn't control the eye. The virus did. The eye operated independently, scanning the laboratory with a cold, mechanical precision, while what remained of Birkin's conscious mind flickered somewhere behind his original corneas. He could still see through his human eyes in these first minutes. He could still smell the copper of his own blood. He called out a name, his daughter's, and the sound that came from his throat was recognizable as language for approximately the last time. The virus hadn't yet reached his vocal architecture, but it was already mapping the route. The USS Alpha Team's tactical failure in those first 60 seconds was not a failure of training. Their formation held, their weapons were raised, and their instinct to concentrate fire on center mass was textbook correct for any humanoid threat. The problem was that center mass was no longer where it had been. The virus had shifted Birkin's vital organs laterally as it expanded his torso, relocating his heart and lungs 3 inches to the left of their original position as a passive defensive response to incoming fire. Every burst of submachine gun rounds that struck what the soldiers calculated to be his cardiovascular center punched instead through an expanding cavity of new muscle that the G virus had already flagged as expendable. The tissue repaired behind the bullets faster than the brass cases hit the floor. The operators had trained extensively on human anatomy. They were firing at a diagram that no longer applied. The eye on the shoulder tracked each muzzle flash independently, feeding positional data to the new neural cluster, which then directed Birkin's body with a coordination that bypassed his conscious input entirely. He didn't decide to swing his right arm. The arm moved because the virus had already calculated the angle, the force required, and the structural integrity of the target. The lead operator was struck across his chest plate with enough lateral force to collapse both lungs simultaneously. He was dead before he completed his fall. The second operator managed 3 steps of backward movement before the claw found him. The third and fourth died in the same motion, the arms sweeping in a horizontal arc that the virus had determined was the most energy-efficient way to clear the available space. Hunk survived because he did the one thing his training hadn't explicitly prepared him for. He stopped moving entirely. His survival instinct, honed by years of high mortality operations, correctly identified that the shoulder eye was tracking motion. He pressed himself into the shadow behind a ruptured coolant pipe and remained motionless while the creature processed the room. The eye swept across his position twice. Both times, his stillness registered as non-threat, and the eye moved on. He watched the duralumin case sink into the drainage channel mud as Birkin waded past it, the creature's focus already oriented towards something deeper in the underground grid. Hunk waited 4 full minutes before he retrieved it. He was the only member of Alpha Team with a pulse. The mission, by any rational metric, was a catastrophe. By Hunk's personal metric, objective secured, operator breathing, it was incomplete but salvageable. What Birkin moved toward wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't even, at this stage, Sherry. The Stage 1 drive was broader and less specific than later mutations would become. It was a general reproductive survey, a biological census of the surrounding environment. The virus needed to know what genetic material was available within range. It was broadcasting a chemical signal through Birkin's sweat glands, a pheromone sequence that operated on frequencies below human olfactory detection, but that smaller mammals with more sensitive chemoreceptors would register clearly. The rats in the drainage network began moving toward him rather than away. This was not incidental. This was the first external act of G-virus propagation, and it happened before Birkin reached the main pump junction. The outbreak above the surface began not with a single contaminated water supply, but with the pheromone-guided movement of infected rodents through every crack and maintenance shaft in the municipal grid. Part 22. The Broken Vials. The secondary T-virus vials that the USS team had packed as a supplementary retrieval bonus were stored in a standard-issue hard foam case clipped to the belt of the third operator. When Birkin's arm cleared the room, the case struck the concrete lip of the drainage channel at an angle that popped the foam lining and cracked 4 of the 6 glass vials simultaneously. The remaining 2 cracked when the body landed on top of the case in the water. None of this was deliberate on Birkin's part. The virus had not planned the contamination of the Raccoon City water supply. It was a consequence of physics, poor secondary containment protocol, and the specific geometry of where a man happened to die. The T-virus variant inside those vials was not the standard zombie strain. It was a refined research batch, a temperature-stable suspension formulated for long-distance transport, meaning it had been chemically treated to remain viable in a wider range of environmental conditions than the laboratory version. The standard strain degraded in water over 18 to 24 hours. This transport variant maintained viability for up to 72 hours, in moving water at temperatures between 4 and 20 degrees Celsius. The sewer drainage network of Raccoon City maintained a consistent temperature of approximately 12 degrees Celsius in its lower channels. The virus had stumbled into an ideal medium and found a survival window 3 times longer than its designers had intended. The rats were the critical vector, but not in the way most post-incident analyses have assumed. Early government reports described the rats as passive carriers who transferred the virus through bites, a straightforward transmission model that made intuitive sense and was also substantially wrong. The rats didn't need to bite anyone. They were infected within 40 minutes of the viral breach, their small bodies absorbing the viral load through permeable gut membranes as they consumed contaminated matter in the drainage channels. Once infected, they began shedding the virus through their urine at concentrations several times higher than the water they had consumed. They then scattered upward through the maintenance shafts into the residential and commercial infrastructure of the city, urinating on food preparation surfaces, in pantries, along kitchen countertops, inside the ventilation ducts of the restaurants on the main commercial strip. By the time the water treatment contamination became the focus of the post-outbreak investigation, the rat-based surface contamination had already created dozens of independent infection nodes completely disconnected from the water supply. The water treatment facility failure is the element most frequently cited in retrospective analyses because it is the most dramatic single point of systemic failure. The plant's filtration system was operating on infrastructure that the city council had deferred upgrading for 11 consecutive fiscal years. The maintenance budget consistently redirected toward the stadium renovation project and downtown repaving contracts that had proven more politically useful. The chemical treatment process in place was effective against bacterial contamination and standard organic particulate. It was not designed to neutralize a retroviral agent with a protein shell architecture that had been specifically engineered to survive industrial processing conditions. The virus passed through every filtration stage intact. The UV treatment system, the one technology that might have degraded the viral envelope, had been offline for 6 weeks, pending a parts order that nobody had flagged as urgent. The first confirmed surface cases appeared in the northeastern residential district, a neighborhood whose aging pipe infrastructure had the most direct connection to the lowest filtration stage. These residents began presenting with symptoms within 36 hours of the initial viral breach. The symptoms were initially indistinguishable from a severe influenza strain: high fever, photophobia, progressive muscular rigidity, and a characteristic darkening of the subdermal capillary network that the first attending physicians documented as a peculiar rash. The Raccoon City General Emergency Intake log for the 48-hour window following the breach shows a 17-fold increase in admissions with overlapping symptom clusters. 3 separate attending physicians filed internal memos requesting consultation with the regional CDC office. None of those memos received a response before the hospital's communication lines were compromised. The company was aware of the contamination within 6 hours of the viral breach. Their environmental monitoring network, a series of automated chemical sensors installed in the municipal water system, ostensibly as part of a city contract for industrial safety compliance, flagged the T-virus signature in the lower pipe network almost immediately. The internal alert was routed to a crisis management team that had standing orders not to contact municipal authorities under any circumstances. Their directive was containment through misdirection, seeding false reports of a burst chemical storage drum at an industrial site on the city's western edge to redirect investigative attention, quietly positioning additional USS units along the perimeter roads under the cover of a fictional military exercise, and beginning the preparation of the cover story that would frame the eventual destruction of the city as an accidental industrial disaster. They began executing this plan while the city's residents were still sleeping, unaware that the water coming from their taps had been changed into something irreversible. Part 23. Why Birkin Needed Sherry. The reproductive imperative that the G virus installed in its primary host was not a simple biological drive analogous to animal instinct. It was a chemical logic system, a parallel processing architecture that the virus assembled inside the host's endocrine network and ran alongside whatever remained of the host's own neural activity. It didn't replace Birkin's brain. It added a second brain beneath it, one that operated on a faster cycle, and whose outputs were expressed as physical compulsions that the original mind experienced as overwhelming, irresistible urges rather than conscious decisions. The distinction is important because it explains the behavioral paradox that later researchers found so difficult to reconcile. Stage 1 and early stage 2. Birkin demonstrated goal-directed behavior that was clearly more sophisticated than mindless predation, yet he was simultaneously incapable of recognizing his wife or responding to verbal communication. He wasn't mindless. He was operating on a different mind. The genetic targeting system is the most sophisticated component of the G virus's reproductive apparatus, and it remains the element that no subsequent research program ever successfully reverse-engineered. The virus maintained a continuous chemical map of its host's original genetic profile, a baseline template assembled from the host's own DNA during the initial infection phase, and used this template to generate a pheromone detection system sensitive enough to identify partial genetic matches in the surrounding environment. The closer the genetic relationship between the host and a potential target, the stronger the chemical signal the target produced. A stranger produced no signal. A distant relative produced a faint one. A direct blood descendant produced a signal that the virus's chemical sensors registered as overwhelming. A biological beacon that the host's reconstructed neural architecture was physically incapable of ignoring. Sherry Birkin was 12 years old and had been removed from the laboratory environment several hours before her father's mutation. She was in the police station, moving through corridors that she didn't understand, in a city she could no longer recognize as safe. She had no awareness of what her father had become. She had no awareness that his virus was tracking her. The signal her cells broadcast, the half-match of a child carrying one copy of her father's genetic template, was registering in his chemical detection system through concrete floors, through steel doors, through 200 meters of city infrastructure. The virus knew she was there in the way that a compass knows where north is. Not through thought, not through memory, but through the irreducible pull of a physical force. What makes the Sherry Birkin case particularly significant from a virological standpoint is that she represented the closest theoretically compatible match available to the stage 1 host, but she was not a guaranteed successful implantation. Genetic compatibility for G virus embryo integration requires a minimum threshold of shared chromosomal markers, approximately 68%, based on the data recovered from the failed implantations documented in the later stages of the outbreak. A direct biological parent-child relationship provides roughly 50% shared genetic material as a baseline. The G virus had modified Birkin's own genome extensively during the mutation process, adding novel sequences that the original human genome did not contain. This meant that his post-infection genetic profile was partly alien, and the matching system was using this modified profile rather than his original human baseline. The 68% threshold, when calculated against a modified genome, could potentially be met by a child who shared his original human DNA at 50%, plus an additional partial match to the viral modifications expressed in his cells. This is why the embryo implantation into Sherry despite being carried out by a creature with no remaining cognitive capacity for precision, partially succeeded where every non-relative implantation catastrophically failed. Her immune system recognized the embryo as foreign, as it would, but did not immediately trigger the full cascade rejection response that destroyed non-compatible hosts within minutes. Instead, her body entered a prolonged, high-fever suppression state, a biological negotiation between her immune architecture and the embryo's integration attempt. This window, the fever phase, was the only reason there was time for a vaccine to matter. In non-compatible hosts, the window didn't exist. The rejection was total and instantaneous. Sherry's partial compatibility didn't protect her, but it slowed the process enough to create a margin, the fragment of Birkin's human consciousness that persisted into the early mutation stages, and its role in directing him towards Sherry is the element of the G virus case that subsequent psychological researchers found most disturbing. The virus had co-opted paternal instinct and converted it into a propagation drive. He wasn't hunting his daughter because he wanted to harm her. He was hunting his daughter because the deepest biological architecture of his human psychology, the drive to protect his genetic lineage, to ensure its continuation, had been seized by the virus and repurposed without modification. The emotion was real. The mechanism that expressed it had been replaced entirely. Part 24. G. Virus Birkin in the city. The Raccoon City underground infrastructure was built in 3 distinct construction phases spanning from the early 1900s through to a major expansion project completed in 1979, and the result was a subterranean network of profound architectural inconsistency. Victorian-era brick channels ran adjacent to mid-century cast iron mains that in turn connected to the modern, reinforced concrete drainage shafts installed during the 70s expansion. The result was a labyrinth of mismatched junctions, unexpected dead ends, elevation changes that didn't appear on any single complete map, and structural idiosyncrasies that the city's own maintenance crews had spent decades working around rather than resolving. For a human navigator, the underground was a genuine maze. For Birkin, at stage 1, with a chemical tracking system that required no visual reference and a physical profile that allowed him to breach any structural barrier he encountered, it was a corridor with one destination and infinite paths to reach it. His movement through the drainage network was not the frantic, disorganized rampage that the surviving security footage might suggest. The virus was optimizing his locomotion in real time, reallocating muscle mass to his legs during transit phases to increase ground speed, and then redistributing it back to his upper body when his sensors detected a structural obstacle requiring forced entry. He was burning caloric reserves at an extraordinary rate. The virus's metabolic demand during active mutation phases is estimated at roughly 40 times basal human requirements. And this is reflected in the behavior patterns documented on the facility's internal cameras. He would move in, sustained, fast bursts of 30 to 60 seconds, then pause at junctions for 10 to 15 seconds, while the virus conducted its chemical scan and recalibrated his heading. These pauses were mistaken by the surviving security personnel as signs of confusion or disorientation. They were not. They were processing intervals. The company's monitoring software did flag his presence in the drainage network. The environmental sensors, the same network that had detected the T-virus contamination hours earlier, registered his movement through acoustic vibration analysis and the chemical signature of G-virus byproducts in the drainage water. The alert was routed to the crisis management team's console at 11:47 p.m. on September 22nd. The duty officer acknowledged the alert confirmed that the primary USS Alpha Team's status was unknown, requested authorization to deploy the secondary containment unit that was positioned in the suburban perimeter, and was denied authorization on the grounds that deploying an additional armed unit into the municipal drainage network without a civilian cover story would risk exposure of the facility's existence. The secondary containment unit remained at its perimeter station. The duty officer logged the denial and went back to monitoring the console. The secondary containment unit deployed anyway, 47 minutes later, after the duty officer received confirmation that Alpha Team was entirely unresponsive and that the drainage network's internal sensors were showing G-virus chemical signatures moving toward the laboratory access shafts. The unit was 6 operators equipped with military-grade weaponry and explicit orders to intercept and neutralize. They entered the drainage network through the northeast maintenance access point at 12:34 a.m. on September 23rd. Their last radio contact with the monitoring console was logged at 12:51 a.m. The console recorded 17 seconds of automatic weapons fire, followed by silence. The duty officer logged this too. He logged everything. None of his logs were included in the post-incident recovery package. Leon S., Kennedy, and Claire Redfield entered the Raccoon City Police Department at approximately the same time that Birkin was moving through the lower drainage channels beneath it. Their paths through the building and its connected infrastructure ran in a consistent, near parallel with his trajectory through the underground. Not by design, but because the G-virus's tracking of Sherry's genetic signal was pulling Birkin through the same structural geography that the 2 survivors were navigating toward exits and supply caches. They were, without knowing it, moving in the same direction as the thing hunting the girl they were trying to protect. The spatial relationship between their routes and his was documented only in retrospect, when researchers overlaid the building's security footage timeline against the drainage network's sensor logs. The proximity was closer than either survivor was ever told. Part 25. Birkin infects Chief Irons. Brian Irons had been in the company's pocket for 11 years. The initial approach had been standard corporate intelligence procedure. A junior umbrella legal representative had identified him during his 3rd year as a detective, when an internal affairs investigation into evidence tampering had reached a stage that could have ended his career. The company made the investigation disappear in exchange for a standing arrangement that required Irons to suppress any police reports, missing persons filings, or criminal investigations that touched on company-affiliated personnel or property. He was paid a quarterly retainer that arrived as a consulting fee from a shell architectural firm. He was never told the full scope of what he was protecting. He had made a deliberate professional choice not to ask. By September of 1998, Irons had accumulated enough personal knowledge of the company's operations in the city, through 11 years of willful blindness to evidence that passed through his own department, to understand that what was happening on the night of the 23rd was not an industrial accident. He had been contacted by his company handler 2 days earlier and given a contingency package, a set of instructions for managing civil disorder, a list of phone numbers to not call, and a promise of extraction to a secure location once the situation was resolved. He was told to remain in his office, secure the building, and wait. He did all 3. He locked the station's gates, isolated himself in his private office with his personal firearm and a bottle of bourbon, and waited for the extraction that was not coming. The contingency package had been assembled by a company administrator who had not been informed that the crisis management timeline included a total facility abandonment of the city within 72 hours. The extraction promise was a procedural lie designed to keep a useful asset in a useful position for as long as possible. Irons was not on the evacuation manifest. He was on a different list. When Birkin breached the police station's lower level, he did not enter through a door. The structural assessment of the damage conducted by the recovery teams afterward determined that he came through the exterior basement wall, reinforced concrete 30 centimeters thick, from the direction of the adjacent drainage access shaft. The force required to breach that wall, estimated from the impact pattern and the degree of structural deformation, was consistent with a striking mass of approximately 400 kilograms, moving at a velocity of roughly 8 meters per second. He was not trying to enter the building quietly. The chemical signal was close, and the virus had moved him past the optimization phase into the direct approach. He found Irons before he found Sherry, because Irons was on the ground floor and Sherry was higher in the building. The encounter was brief and wholly one-sided. Irons fired his personal sidearm, a .357 Magnum revolver, 6 rounds, and every shot connected. Birkin's tissue absorbed all 6 without registering them as tactically significant. The virus was not interested in Brian Irons as an obstacle. It was interested in him as a test. The reproductive drive at stage 1 was not yet specific enough to target only the primary genetic match. It expressed itself as a general propagation attempt whenever a viable-seeming biological candidate was in immediate physical contact. Irons was in contact. The virus ran its genetic scan in approximately 2 seconds of chemical analysis. The result was a catastrophic incompatibility. Irons shared none of the specific chromosomal markers required for embryo integration. The virus implanted the embryo regardless. This is the detail that most biological analyses of the Irons case have struggled to explain, because a non-compatible implantation serves no propagation purpose. The embryo cannot integrate and will not produce a second-generation host. The most coherent current theory is that the stage 1 reproductive drive lacked the refinement to actively abort the implantation sequence once the proximity and physical contact conditions had been met, even when the compatibility scan returned a negative result. It was an error state in the viral logic, a compulsion that had been triggered before the analysis was complete, and that could not be cancelled retroactively. The embryo was already moving before the virus had finished reading the result. The outcome in Irons was the worst-case biological scenario. A non-compatible embryo in a fully healthy adult male triggers a cascading immune response of extreme violence. The body recognizes the embryo as a massively invasive foreign body and attacks it with every available immunological resource simultaneously, while the embryo, which is not mindless but operates on a survival directive of its own, fights back by accelerating its own development to try to reach integration before the immune system destroys it. The resulting cellular conflict happens at a speed that healthy tissue cannot structurally withstand. The abdominal cavity becomes the site of a biological war fought in seconds rather than days. Irons survived the implantation for approximately 40 minutes. His death was not quiet. The abortive creature that emerged from him was not a failure of the virus in any meaningful sense. It was the intended output of a failed implantation, a secondary propagation attempt, a genetic fragment cast outward in the hope that it might find compatible material in the surrounding environment. It was mindless, hostile, and biologically unstable. Its lifespan measured in hours rather than days. Claire Redfield's intervention prevented it from leaving the office. The fact that she encountered it at all was a function of the building's geography rather than any directed behavior on its part. It was simply moving toward the nearest available warmth and motion. It had no mission. It was the virus's equivalent of a missed shot. Part 26, G-Virus, Birkin Stage 2. The transition to Stage 2 was not triggered by a timer or a cellular checkpoint in the way that the original research documentation implied it would be. Birkin's theoretical framework for the mutation stages described them as sequential phases that the host would progress through as the viral load reached specific density thresholds in different tissue groups, a linear escalation model that made sense as a design goal and proved completely inaccurate as a biological prediction. The actual trigger for Stage 2 was trauma, specifically the sustained high-caliber gunfire that Leon S. Kennedy directed at Birkin's Stage 1 form in the underground parking structure beneath the police station activated the virus's emergency restructuring protocol, a defensive response mode that the virus initiated when its damage repair systems calculated that the current physical configuration was insufficient to withstand the level of incoming trauma. The virus didn't upgrade Birkin because it was time. It upgraded him because he was losing. The structural changes of Stage 2 were substantially more radical than Stage 1's expansion had been, because Stage 1 had worked primarily with Birkin's existing anatomy, enlarging, armoring, and supplementing it. Stage 2 began actively demolishing components of his original human architecture that the virus had determined were no longer useful. The human head was the most dramatic example. The skull was not removed, but compressed, forced downward into the chest cavity by the expansion of a new calcified cranial structure that assembled itself above his shoulders over approximately 90 seconds. The new skull was thicker, denser, and shaped to protect the secondary neural cluster that the virus had been building since Stage 1. His original head remained functional in a vestigial sense. His original brainstem was still connected to his spinal column. But the cognitive centers, the language centers, the memory architecture were now receiving almost no blood flow. They weren't destroyed, they were starved. William Birkin, the scientist, was not dead at Stage 2. He was cut off. The additional limbs that emerged from his abdomen were not arms in any functional human sense. They were manipulator appendages whose primary design purpose was climbing. Specifically, climbing through the vertical shafts and elevator infrastructure of the laboratory facility that the virus's chemical sensors had already mapped as the most likely terrain between Birkin's current position and Sherry's. The joints were inverted relative to human elbow anatomy, allowing them to lock into a load-bearing configuration when pressed against a vertical surface, and to release and re-grip in a cycle fast enough to propel his now considerably heavier body upward through a concrete shaft at a speed that building engineers later estimated no manufactured climbing system could have matched. Annette Birkin was in the laboratory facility when Stage 2 Birkin entered it. She was aware that her husband had injected himself. She had found the evidence in the laboratory before the outbreak reached the upper levels, and she had spent the intervening hours in a state that cannot be accurately characterized as either grief or denial, because it contained elements of both while being reducible to neither. She was a scientist. Her first response to any event, including catastrophic personal loss, was to try to understand the mechanism. She had pulled Birkin's own research notes on the Stage 1 to 2 transition and had read them in the 60 minutes before he reached the facility. She knew, on a technical level, exactly what she was going to see. She had thought this preparation would help. It did not. She spoke to him on the skywalk. This detail is frequently omitted in operational summaries of the incident, because it has no tactical relevance and is uncomfortable to document. But it is part of the facility's audio record. She said his name 3 times. She said it in the flat, clinical tone that she had spent years developing as her professional register. The tone she used in the lab, not the one she used at home. Because by the time she reached the skywalk, the home register was not something she had access to anymore. The Stage 2 form did not pause, did not orient its tracking eyes toward her, and did not register her chemical signature as anything other than a non-compatible obstacle between its current position and its target. The virus had no record of her. The man who had kept that record was behind a wall of starved neurons that no voice could reach. Part 27. G virus. Birkin, Stage 3. The firepower used against Stage 2. Birkin in the laboratory facility included anti-materiel rounds deployed from a specialized weapons cache in the facility's emergency armory. Hardware that the laboratory had been required by internal company protocol to maintain precisely because the research being conducted below was classified at a level that acknowledged the possibility of containment failure. The armory existed because Umbrella had always known, in the cold, actuarial language of its safety planning documents, that the G virus might one day need to be stopped by force inside the building that housed it. The irony of a company arming its own researchers against the products of their own research is not subtle, but it is consistent with the institutional logic that produced the program in the first place. The transition to Stage 3 was again trauma-triggered, and the physical scale of the restructuring reflected the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. Stage 2 had been a defensive adaptation to sustained small arms fire. Stage 3 was a defensive adaptation to ordnance that had begun to genuinely compromise the viral maintenance systems. Rounds that were penetrating the calcified armor of Stage 2 and reaching soft tissue in quantities large enough that the regeneration systems were running at capacity rather than surplus. The virus calculated a resource allocation problem. It could continue repairing Stage 2's architecture under sustained heavy fire, or it could temporarily redirect every available cellular resource into a structural overhaul that would produce a configuration significantly more resistant to the incoming trauma. It chose the overhaul. The transition period, during which Birkin was functionally immobile and actively vulnerable, lasted approximately 4 minutes. That 4-minute window was the only point in the entire Raccoon City incident at which the Stage 3 form could have been definitively neutralized. Nobody in the facility knew the window existed. The research documentation that would have predicted it was in Birkin's encrypted personal files, to which nobody else had the decryption key. The bone spike array that characterized Stage 3 was not a weapon in the primary design sense. It was armor that happened to be lethal. The spikes distributed the force of incoming projectiles across a much wider surface area than flat plate armor could achieve, effectively reducing the per-unit impact energy transmitted to the underlying tissue to a level below what was required to cause meaningful damage. The geometry of the array, the specific angles and spacing of the individual spikes, was not random. The virus had assembled it according to a structural optimization that ballistics researchers, examining the recovered forensic evidence years later, described as consistent with the most advanced theoretical models in anti-penetration armor design. The virus had arrived at a solution that human engineers were still theorizing about by iterating through cellular trial and error in 4 minutes of frantic biological construction. The multiple tracking cores embedded in the chest cavity at this stage represented the virus's most aggressive expansion of Birkin's sensory apparatus. Stage 1 had added 1 eye. Stage 3 added 6, arranged in a configuration that provided 360 degrees of simultaneous optical coverage with no blind spots. Each eye connected to the secondary neural cluster through independent pathways. meaning that the destruction of any single tracking core did not degrade the overall spatial awareness of the organism. They had to all be destroyed simultaneously to produce a meaningful tactical advantage, and they were protected by the bone spike array that made approaching them in the first place nearly impossible. The laboratory suffered structural damage during this phase that the building's internal systems had no capacity to address. The automated fire suppression system discharged in 4 separate sectors and was overwhelmed in all 4. The internal communication network failed progressively as Birkin's movement destroyed the junction boxes that connected the facility's different wings. The self-destruct countdown, initiated remotely by the company's crisis management team, who had determined that the laboratory was now a write-off, was already running behind the blast doors of the facility's deepest level. The people who initiated the countdown had already left the city. They initiated it from a console in a building in another state and did not watch the result. Part 28. Killing. Annette. Annette Birkin's role in the Nest facility has historically been documented in the narrow terms of her function as her husband's secondary research lead, the supporting scientist behind the primary genius, the technical executor of his conceptual vision. This framing was partly her own construction. She was aware from early in their shared career that the company responded to Birkin's work with a reverence it would not have extended to hers if she had presented the same research independently, and she had made a pragmatic, clear-headed decision to attach her scientific ambitions to his trajectory rather than compete with the institutional bias directly. She was not passive. She was strategic. The genetic sequencing models that stabilized the G virus in its final form in the summer of 1998 were solved by Annette, working from first principles during a 3-week period when Birkin was in an obsessive spiral that had taken him away from the core mathematical problem and toward a peripheral question about propagation timing. She solved the problem he was stuck on and handed him the solution without putting her name on it, because she knew that a solution with his name attached would move faster through the company's approval architecture. She was right. None of this matters to what happened on the skywalk. But it is the context in which her death should be understood, not as the disposal of a secondary character, but as the destruction of the person who had, more than any other single human being, made the G virus possible. The Stage 3 form did not register her presence as a threat. The bone spike array was not deployed in response to her proximity. The tracking eyes catalogued her position and her movement and processed her as a non-compatible organism of insufficient mass to constitute a meaningful obstacle to the primary propagation objective. The blow that killed her was not a targeted strike. It was a clearing motion, the equivalent of a person walking through a space brushing a lightweight object off a surface without slowing down. The force transferred to her chest was approximately 7 times what was required to produce fatal thoracic trauma in an adult human. The disproportion was not cruelty. The virus had no concept of proportionate force. It allocated whatever force was mechanically generated by the motion it had initiated. She died on the skywalk in a way that took several minutes and that the laboratory's audio system recorded. The recording was included in the data package recovered by the federal teams after the city's destruction, was classified immediately upon recovery, and has not been released. The broader tragedy of her death is not the personal loss, though that is real, but the systemic one. Annette Birkin was the only person alive who fully understood both the mathematical architecture of the G virus's genetic sequencing and the theoretical framework of the devil vaccine's antibody targeting mechanism. Birkin had understood the virus in intuitive, almost aesthetic terms. He felt his way through the biological logic by instinct and genius. Annette understood it in formal, reproducible, mathematical terms. The research documentation that survived the nest facility's self-destruction was extensive but incomplete in precisely the areas that required her mathematical framework to interpret correctly. Every subsequent attempt to perfect or replicate the G virus ran into the same wall. The foundational sequencing models existed only in fragments, the complete versions having existed primarily in her working memory. She had not written them down in full because she had not anticipated needing to. She had always expected to be there to explain them. Part 29. G. Virus Birkin, Stage 4. The ordnance that triggered the Stage 4 transition was a rocket-propelled explosive deployed in a confined space. The kind of trauma that Stage 3's bone spike array, despite its considerable defensive capability, was not architecturally designed to withstand. The spikes distributed lateral impact forces efficiently. They were not effective against a concussive overpressure wave that attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously, collapsing inward rather than penetrating from a single direction. The blast didn't breach the armor. It vibrated it. The resonant frequency of the calcium lattice at Stage 3, subjected to sufficient overpressure, produced fracture propagation through the spike array that the virus's repair systems registered as a category-level structural emergency. Damage not to the soft tissue within, but to the load-bearing architecture of the armored exterior itself. The Stage 4 response stripped away everything the virus had built that was not essential to immediate survival. The upright posture went first. The two-legged configuration was abandoned because the virus calculated that the most efficient trauma-avoidance strategy in a confined environment with a projectile-based threat was horizontal, low-profile, high-speed movement, rather than the elevated, relatively slow, bipedal locomotion of the previous stages. The bone spike array was partially reabsorbed and partially repurposed, the calcium deposits redistributing into the reinforced jaw structure that became the dominant anatomical feature of Stage 4. The tracking cores migrated toward the anterior of the skull, their coverage narrowing from the 360 panoramic array of Stage 3 to a forward-focused, binocular-style configuration, optimized for targeting moving objects at close range rather than spatial monitoring of a static environment. The jaw was the most biologically extravagant feature of the Stage 4 form, and the one that generated the most retrospective scientific commentary, because it served no propagation function whatsoever. The G virus's foundational design goal was reproduction, and a jaw capable of shearing through structural steel contributed nothing to embryo implantation. It was purely a survival feature. The virus, calculating that the host needed to remove the immediate lethal threat before the reproductive objective could be resumed, had allocated an enormous proportion of the available cellular resources to building the most effective close-quarters offensive weapon the human body's calcium and keratin supply could produce. The speed increase between Stage 3 and Stage 4 was the element that proved most disorienting to the people present. The Stage 3 form had moved with a ponderous, overwhelming power, slow enough to track visually, fast enough to be catastrophic. Stage 4 moved in a manner that observers described in after-action reports filed much later and under considerable psychological strain, as inconsistent with the visual information their eyes were providing. The brain processes predictive motion models based on mass to velocity ratios derived from prior experience. Stage 4 violated every ratio that human experience provided. An object of that mass should not move at that speed. The cognitive processing gap between what observers expected to see and what they actually saw produced a delay in reactive response that the virus had not designed for but benefited from enormously. Part 30. Sherry infected. The embryo that Birkin implanted in Sherry during his stage 1 to 2 transition period was structurally identical to the ones that had produced catastrophic rejection in non-compatible hosts. The difference was not in the embryo, but in the immune environment it encountered. Sherry's partial genetic compatibility produced what the subsequent medical literature has termed a suspended rejection cascade, a state in which her immune system recognized the embryo as foreign and mounted a response, but in which the response was modulated by the partial genetic recognition signal in a way that prevented the full, explosive immune mobilization that destroyed non-compatible hosts. The fever was the visible expression of this suspended state. Her body temperature reached 41 degrees Celsius within 2 hours of implantation, a level at which cognitive function becomes impaired and sustained exposure produces irreversible neurological damage. The fever was the immune system burning fuel at maximum capacity to hold the embryo in stasis, not integrating, not being destroyed, but contained. This was an unstable equilibrium. The immune system was running at a rate it could not sustain indefinitely. The embryo's own integration drive was continuously probing the boundary the immune response had established. The window during which the devil vaccine could intervene, between the onset of the fever and the point at which the embryo's integration probes, found a breach in the immune boundary and began permanent cellular fusion, was estimated at between 4 and 8 hours, depending on the individual's baseline immune strength and the specific integration velocity of the embryo. Annette had provided the vaccine protocols during the brief window before the stage 3 encounter ended her life. The precision of the instructions she left was a function of the same methodical intelligence she had applied throughout her career. She had known that she might not survive the laboratory. She had understood that Claire was the only remaining person with both the physical access to the cleanroom facilities and the personal motivation to complete the synthesis, and she had structured her instructions accordingly, assuming no prior chemistry knowledge, anticipating the specific equipment that would be available in the cleanroom, and including contingency steps for 2 probable points of synthesis failure. She had written the protocol in approximately 12 minutes on a laboratory notepad in the margin of a research folder she had been carrying. It was the last document she produced. It saved a child's life. The devil vaccine's mechanism was not a general antiviral. It was a targeted molecular disassembly agent, a compound engineered to recognize the specific protein signature of the G virus embryo's outer membrane and catalyze its degradation. It did not attack the virus broadly. It attacked the embryo specifically. This specificity was both its primary strength and the reason that synthesizing it outside the nest facility's dedicated laboratory environment was as demanding as it was. The precursor compounds required were available in the cleanroom, but their combination required temperature control accurate to within 0.5 degree Celsius and a mixing sequence that, if performed in the wrong order, produced an inert compound rather than an active one. Claire Redfield had no chemistry training beyond a standard high school curriculum. She completed the synthesis correctly on the first attempt. This fact is documented in the facility's cleanroom environmental logs and has never been given the attention it deserves. Part 31. The Devil Vaccine. The antibodies that the Devil vaccine left behind in Sherry's biology were not a planned outcome. Annette's protocol was designed to destroy the embryo and return the patient's immune system to baseline. What happened instead was that the molecular disassembly process, when applied to an embryo in partial integration, with a partially compatible host produced a third outcome that the protocol's designers had not modeled. The degraded embryo fragments, rather than being fully cleared by the immune system, were partially absorbed by the same immune architecture that had been fighting them. The immune cells that had spent hours constructing targeted responses to the embryo's specific protein signatures did not retire those responses when the embryo was destroyed. They retained them. They encoded them into Sherry's adaptive immune memory as permanent antibody templates. This process, accidental, unrepeatable, in any controlled setting that subsequent researchers attempted, produced an immune profile unlike anything in the documented medical literature. The antibodies were not passive records of a past infection in the manner of standard immune memory. They were active, high-affinity binding agents that maintained a continuous low-level surveillance of her bloodstream, capable of identifying and binding to G-virus protein signatures at concentrations far below what standard assay methods could detect. Her immune system had, through the specific mechanism of partial embryo degradation in a partially compatible host, essentially been trained to destroy the G-virus more efficiently than any vaccine program could have achieved through conventional immunological methods. The arrested aging was not identified in the immediate post-recovery period because the federal team's medical personnel were focused on the acute symptoms, the residual fever, the evidence of embryo integration, the overall trauma of a 12-year-old who had spent 12 hours in a collapsing biohazard facility. It became apparent in the medium term, as the standard growth and developmental benchmarks that the facility's physicians tracked in all long-termer subjects began to diverge from the expected trajectory. The precise mechanism by which the G-virus antibody complex moderated the aging process was not understood for many years, and remains only partially characterized in the classified research literature. The leading current hypothesis connects it to the G-virus's own cellular immortality architecture. The virus's designed resistance to apoptosis, the programmed cell death that drives the aging process in normal human biology, appears to have been partially transcribed into Sherry's own cellular regulation system through the antibody integration process. She was not immune to aging. She was resistant to it in a way that was quantifiable but not absolute, and that produced effects most visible in the deceleration of the telomere shortening process that standard aging research had established as the primary molecular clock of human longevity. The government scientists who studied her over the following years produced a body of research that filled classified archives and informed a generation of black-budget biological weapons development programs. None of this research was shared with Sherry. She was informed that she was being monitored for health reasons related to her exposure. She was not told what the monitoring was finding. She was not given access to her own file. Part 33. What the government found. The federal recovery operation that reached the Raccoon City perimeter within hours of the Arklay Mountain nuclear strike was organized under a classified executive directive that had been drafted 11 months before the outbreak occurred. The existence of this pre-drafted directive, its specific language, its pre-authorized resource allocations, its detailed protocols for evidence suppression and survivor management, is the most damning single piece of documentation in the entire history of the company's relationship with the United States federal government, because it proves beyond any interpretive ambiguity that the government had anticipated the possibility of a large-scale municipal biological incident connected to Umbrella's operations, and had prepared a response plan that prioritized corporate and federal liability protection above any other consideration, including the safety of the city's civilian population. The directive did not plan for evacuation. It planned for containment, evidence recovery, and narrative control. These are not the same thing. The teams that breached the Nest facility's peripheral substations operated with a specificity of knowledge about the facility's internal layout that could only have come from prior access to the facility's construction and systems documentation. They knew where the backup server arrays were located. They knew which physical evidence to prioritize. They knew which research files had been designated for destruction in the facility's own self-destruct sequence, and which had been routed to analog backup systems that the self-destruct would not reach. They had been briefed. The briefing had come from documents that the federal government had been receiving through its embedded intelligence assets in the company's corporate structure for at least 7 years before the outbreak. The thermite charges used to destroy non-recoverable hardware were military specification demolition devices that are not available through civilian procurement channels. Their presence at the scene confirms the involvement of military logistics support in the recovery operation, a fact that required the suppression of procurement records, transportation manifests, and the personal service records of the specialized personnel who carried and deployed them. The institutional architecture required to suppress all of those records simultaneously, within the time frame available, could only have been assembled in advance. It had been. The preparation had been quiet, patient, and thorough, in the way that only operations with years of planning behind them can be. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield's detention was handled by a unit that had specific standing orders regarding the management of civilian witnesses to company-adjacent biological incidents. The orders were detailed. Witnesses were to be separated immediately, transported to different holding locations, and subjected to parallel interrogation protocols designed to identify any communications they had made before their detention that might have introduced classified information into uncontrolled channels. If no such communications had been made, witnesses were to be processed through a legal framework that presented non-disclosure as voluntary, while making the alternatives clear enough that the distinction between choice and coercion was largely theoretical. Leon Kennedy was processed through this framework by federal handlers who correctly identified his law enforcement background and his institutional respect for legitimate authority as leverage points. Claire Redfield was processed by a different team that correctly identified her primary motivation as the welfare of Sherry Birkin and applied pressure accordingly. The official narrative, industrial accident, chemical plant failure, tragic but contained, everything under control, was constructed by a public affairs team that had been on standby since the perimeter deployment began. The narrative was internally consistent, emotionally plausible, and deliberately vague in the specific technical areas where precision would have created legal exposure. It was designed to answer the questions that journalists, municipal officials, and grieving family members would ask in the immediate aftermath, while containing no language that could serve as the basis for legal challenge in any subsequent inquiry. The team that wrote it had written similar documents before, not for this specific event, but for events of the same type. They were professionals at a specific professional task, and they performed it competently. The 100,000 people who died in Raccoon City were not acknowledged in any official communication as victims of a corporate biological incident. They were described in the language of the official narrative as casualties of an industrial accident, a categorization that, under the relevant federal statute, triggered a different liability framework than a corporate malfeasance designation, and one that the company's legal team had spent 3 years preparing to navigate. The distinction between industrial accident and deliberate corporate research program that contaminated a civilian water supply was, in human terms, the difference between a tragedy and a crime. In legal terms, it was the difference between a manageable settlement and an existential institutional threat. The people who made the categorization decision made it in full knowledge of this distinction. Part 34. Sherry in custody. The facility to which Sherry was transferred after the initial federal processing phase was not a hospital. It was classified in federal budgetary documentation as a biological research continuity center, a category of installation that existed in the federal system primarily as a classification mechanism, allowing the government to fund what was functionally a detention and research operation through budget lines that were not subject to the same oversight requirements as either prison facilities or medical research programs. The installation was located in a state whose congressional delegation had historically been reliable supporters of classified defense research funding. The location was not a coincidence. The medical personnel who worked with Sherry in the early years of her detention were, almost without exception, genuinely well-intentioned physicians who had accepted positions at the facility, believing they were contributing to important research on an extraordinary and rare case of viral exposure. Several of them were excellent doctors. Their competence is not in question. What is in question is the institutional framework within which their competence was deployed, the specific research questions they were directed to pursue, the data they were required to report through channels they did not control, and the information they were explicitly prohibited from sharing with their patient. They treated her. They also produced research about her that was used to advance weapons programs that she was never informed existed. Most of them did not know the second part was happening. The institutional design ensured that they didn't need to know for the process to function. The regenerative capacity that became apparent in the medium term was the single most significant biological discovery of the post-Raccoon City research era, and it has remained classified at a level that has prevented its findings from contributing to legitimate medical science in any direct way. The rate of cellular repair that Sherry's system demonstrated, documented through controlled, supervised wound induction experiments that began when she was 14 and continued through her early adult years, exceeded the theoretical maximum of standard human healing physiology by a factor of between 12 and 40, depending on the type and severity of the tissue damage. Bone fractures that would require 6 to 8 weeks of supervised healing in a normal adult resolved completely in her biology within 72 to 96 hours. Soft tissue trauma that would leave permanent scarring in any other subject left no trace after 24 hours. The mechanism, connected to the same apoptosis resistance that drove the aging deceleration, operated on a principle that, if it could have been characterized accurately and published in the open scientific literature, would have represented the most significant advance in regenerative medicine in the history of the discipline. It was not published. It was classified, compartmentalized, and incorporated into research programs that the people directing them had no intention of using to treat injury or disease in the general population. Her psychological development during this period was monitored by a rotating staff of clinical psychologists whose reports, all of which were classified and included in her research file, described a consistent and predictable pattern: high intelligence, strong verbal and analytical capabilities, intense emotional self-containment that the clinicians variously described as a coping mechanism, a trauma response, or a personality characteristic depending on their theoretical orientation. and a carefully maintained surface compliance with institutional expectations that coexisted with a deep, private refusal to accept those expectations as legitimate. She cooperated with the research protocols. She answered the questions she was asked. She did not, from the earliest documented clinical interviews, behave as though she believed the situation she was in was either appropriate or permanent. The clinicians noted this. They did not have the authority to act on it. Part 35. Hunk delivers the sample. Hunk's extraction from the Raccoon City drainage network following the Alpha Team massacre is the portion of the incident that has generated the most operational mythology in the subsequent years, because it is genuinely extraordinary by any rational standard of probability. He was the sole survivor of a 6-person elite unit in an environment that had been completely compromised by both a stage 1 G virus host and a spreading T virus outbreak. His route from the nest facility to the city's surface transit network passed through 3 separate sectors that the environmental sensors had confirmed as active outbreak zones. He had a sealed sample case, the weapon he had entered with, and whatever supplementary equipment he had been able to recover from his dead team members before leaving the facility. He made it out in 4 hours and 27 minutes. The company's post-incident operational review, conducted 6 months after the event, described his extraction as consistent with documented operational parameters for an individual of Hunk's assessed capability rating. This is the driest possible way of acknowledging that a man walked through a city full of active biological weapons and delivered his objective without losing the case. The handoff point at Loire village in France was a location that Hunk had been given in his pre-mission briefing as the contingency extraction destination, the address to use if the primary Raccoon City extraction became unavailable. It was a private facility owned by a company-affiliated European logistics firm that had no public connection to Umbrella's pharmaceutical operations. The executive who received the case, whose operational name in the company's files was Christine Henry, was a senior procurement officer in the European Division's Special Acquisitions Unit. She had been waiting at the facility for 36 hours by the time Hunk arrived. She did not know whether he was coming. She had been told to wait indefinitely. She opened the case and confirmed the sample's integrity using a portable spectrometry unit. The result was positive. The sample was intact, uncompromised, and fully viable. She closed the case, signed the chain of custody document that Hunk presented, and informed him that his mission was considered successfully completed. The exchange took 11 minutes. Hunk left. She moved the case to the facility's secure vault within the hour and sent an encrypted confirmation to the company's crisis management office. The confirmation message, in its entirety, was 4 words. The company's response was 3. The Loire village sample became the master template for every subsequent G virus research program conducted by any of the factions that acquired access to it over the following 2.5 decades. Through theft, through purchase, through the collapse of the company's internal security architecture during the broader Umbrella dissolution proceedings. It was copied, synthesized, analyzed, partially replicated, and partially hybridized more times than any subsequent accounting has been able to fully document. It was used as the baseline material for the T plus G hybridization program. It provided the genetic reference data used in the Curtis Miller replication attempt. It informed the antibody characterization research conducted on Sherry Birkin. It was the seed from which the bioterror era grew, distributed across the world's black market research ecosystem in fragments and partial copies that each retained enough of Birkin's original architecture to be dangerous and lacked enough of it to be controllable. The case that Hunk carried through the ruins of Raccoon City was, in every meaningful sense, the most consequential object in the history of the company. It was a standard Duralumin transit case, foam-lined, with a biometric locking mechanism that Birkin had specified during the Nest facility's design phase. It weighed approximately 3 kilograms, including the sample. Hunk had carried heavier things. He had carried them through worse environments. What made this particular transit notable, in the cold operational terms that Hunk's professional assessment would have applied, was not the content of the case, but the fact that every single other person who had come into contact with the content was dead. Part 36, the Loire Village Lab and the T+G virus. The scientific ambition behind the TPLOSG hybridization program was not unreasonable, given the information available to its architects in the immediate post-Raccoon City period. They had 2 viral platforms, each with clearly identified strengths and clearly identified failure modes. The T virus was an effective, robust, easily transmissible pathogen with a well-characterized infection mechanism, but its output was tactically limited. Mindless, decaying hosts with poor durability and no coordinated behavior. The G virus was an extraordinary piece of biological engineering, with an adaptive capability that nothing else in the company's portfolio approached. But its reproductive specificity made it useless as a deployable weapon at scale, and its progressive erasure of host cognition meant it couldn't produce the intelligent, directable biological soldiers that the company's military clients actually wanted to purchase. The hybrid program was attempting to combine the T virus's transmissibility and the G virus's adaptive repair into a single platform, while eliminating both strains' primary failure modes. It was, stated this way, a coherent engineering objective. The problem was that the 2 viruses operated on fundamentally incompatible biological principles. The T virus worked through passive infection. It entered a cell, rewrote the cell's replication instructions, and propagated itself through the host's tissues without requiring any cooperation from the host's existing regulatory systems. The G virus worked through active engagement with the host's regulatory systems. It monitored, responded to, and directed the host's existing cellular machinery rather than replacing it. Combining them required finding a way to make an active, responsive biological system coexist with a passive, overwriting one inside the same cellular environment. The bioelectric field that characterized the T+G hybrid was not a designed feature. It was an emergent property, an unintended consequence of the conflict between the 2 viral platforms' competing cellular instructions. The T virus component was continuously attempting to overwrite the host cell's electrical regulation, while the G virus component was continuously attempting to maintain and optimize it. The result was a cellular environment in permanent electrical tension, with the competing instructions producing a net electromagnetic output that expressed itself as a measurable field at the surface of the host's body. The researchers who first observed it described it in their internal logs as a containment anomaly, an unexpected data point that didn't fit their model. It took them 6 weeks to realize they hadn't made an error in their measurements. The host was generating its own electricity. The weaponization potential of this property was immediately recognized and immediately prioritized above understanding the mechanism, because the company was operating on a client timeline rather than a scientific one. The military buyers who were funding the Loire Village program wanted a demonstration of capability within a specific window, and the management team had committed to that window without fully understanding what they were building. The scientists protested. The standard, low-level, professional protest that research scientists make when institutional timelines override scientific ones, logged in internal memos, and then ignored. The program continued at the committed pace. The instability of the T plus G strain in host tissue was the consequence of proceeding without fully characterizing the mechanism. The bioelectric field was not a stable feature. It fluctuated based on the competing demands of the two viral platforms, producing output spikes that the host's nervous system was not designed to tolerate, and that caused progressive neurological damage, even in hosts whose initial immune response to the infection appeared manageable. The researchers had created a weapon that worked brilliantly for approximately 48 hours, and then began killing its host through the same electrical mechanism that made it effective. They knew this. They included it in their internal reports. The reports were classified above the access level of the scientists who wrote them and were not shared back with the research team. Part 37, Morpheus D. Duval and the Spencer Rain. Morpheus Duval's biography before his final operation is a useful lens through which to understand the specific type of institutional damage that the company's internal culture produced in its personnel over time. He was not, by any available account, an unstable individual at the beginning of his career. His early performance reviews described him as meticulous, highly productive, and capable of extended focus under pressure, characteristics that the company valued and rewarded. His research contributions in the field of viral protein modeling were substantial enough to earn him senior researcher status within 7 years of his initial appointment, and his loyalty to the company during the most scrutinized phase of the Raccoon City aftermath had been validated by the internal vetting process that the crisis management team applied to all personnel with knowledge of the incident. He was dismissed in the restructuring phase that followed the company's formal dissolution proceedings, 19 months after the Raccoon City incident. His dismissal was handled through the standard bureaucratic mechanism, a termination letter citing organizational restructuring, a severance package structured to minimize legal exposure, and a non-disclosure agreement whose language he had been specifically advised not to challenge. He was given 6 weeks to clear his laboratory. He did not contact the press, the police, or any of the advocacy organizations that were, by this point, beginning to publicize the survivors' testimonies. He collected his personal materials, signed the termination documentation, and left the building. His subsequent 24 months are not fully documented. What is known is that during this period, he spent a significant amount of time and personal financial resources acquiring information about the internal structure of the company's successor entities, the various smaller organizations that had absorbed fragments of its research assets and operational infrastructure, and that this research eventually led him to the Paris facility that stored the T plus G sample alongside the recovered T virus warheads. The security breach he executed was not a crude smash and grab. It was a patient, precisely timed operation that exploited a specific 12-minute window in the facility's security rotation cycle, a window that someone who had spent years inside the company's security architecture would know how to identify and could only have found by applying sustained, careful research to the facility's patterns over several months. His mutation, following the self-injection aboard the Spencer Rain, produced a form that differed substantially from the Birkin precedent in ways that the subsequent analytical literature has attributed to 2 key variables. First, Duval injected into a living, healthy body rather than a dying one, which produced a less chaotic initial cellular response. Second, the T plus G hybrid specific protein architecture interacted with his endocrine system in a way that the pure G virus had not demonstrated in any prior host. with his high baseline testosterone and cortisol levels appearing to modulate the mutation's directional expression toward a more symmetrical, physically refined outcome than the asymmetric, armored configurations that characterize G-virus mutations in male hosts. The female morphology that the mutation produced is the most consistently mischaracterized element of the Duval case in popular retrospective accounts, which have tended to frame it in terms of gender dysphoria narratives that do not reflect the biological reality. The T plus G hybrid's expression of female anatomical characteristics in a male host appears to be a function of the G virus component's cellular optimization logic, identifying the female endocrine template as producing a more efficient structural outcome for the bioelectric field's distribution. The female hormonal baseline produces a different fat-to-muscle tissue ratio that the virus calculated would allow more effective electromagnetic distribution across the host's surface area. It was not a psychological outcome. It was a biological one, driven by the same cold optimization logic that had directed Birkin's mutations. The virus did not care what Duval wanted to look like. It cared what configuration most effectively deployed the electrical capability it was building. The ransom ultimatum he issued was, from a psychological standpoint, the most revealing element of the entire incident. More revealing than the theft, more revealing than the mutation. He had spent 2 years planning an action whose primary stated purpose was to extract financial compensation for the institutional harm the company had done to him and to the world through his work. He hadn't attempted to expose the company. He hadn't attempted to destroy the samples or contact the research community. He hadn't even attempted to negotiate with the company's successor entities directly. He had chosen to take the most extreme possible action, threatening global biological catastrophe, in order to be paid. The psychological profile this revealed was not one of a man committed to justice. It was one of a man committed to recognition, to forcing the world to acknowledge the value of what he had contributed to and been discarded from. The ransom demand was, at its core, a severance package negotiation by other means. Part 38, Curtis Miller and Degeneration. Curtis Miller's case represents the first documented attempt to use the G virus as an instrument of political disclosure rather than weaponization, and it remains the only such attempt in the virus's operational history. Every other individual who acquired and deployed G virus material did so in pursuit of one of 3 goals: military capability, financial leverage, or personal survival. Miller's stated objective, to force public acknowledgement of the corporate cover-up that had killed his family and approximately 100,000 other people, was without precedent in the documented history of the bioterror era, and it was, in the specific manner he chose to pursue it, self-defeating in ways that a more detached analysis might have warned him about. He had lost his sister in the Raccoon City incident. She had been one of the early victims, infected during the first 72 hours, before the government had established its perimeter, before the cover story had been finalized, before anyone outside the immediate response team fully understood what was happening. Her death had been described in the official documentation as a consequence of the industrial accident narrative, her name appearing in a list of casualties that was accurate in its enumeration and completely false in its causal attribution. Miller had spent 8 years trying to challenge this attribution through legitimate channels. Freedom of information, requests that were denied, and denied again. Legal proceedings that were dismissed at the preliminary stage by judges whose relationship to the relevant federal jurisdictions he eventually began to suspect was not coincidental. Journalism contacts who expressed interest and then fell silent. Advocacy organizations that absorbed his testimony and produced no visible result. He was not irrational. He had simply exhausted the rational options and arrived at a conclusion that the mechanisms through which institutional accountability normally functions had been specifically and successfully corrupted in this instance. That was correct. His response to a correct conclusion was to pursue an approach that was wrong, not because his diagnosis of the situation was inaccurate, but because his proposed treatment was catastrophically disproportionate to any achievable goal. Injecting himself with the G virus in a populated facility would not produce a congressional investigation. It would produce a biological incident that would be used to further discredit the survivor community's claims by associating them with terrorism. He knew this at some level. He proceeded anyway. This is the psychological element that the subsequent analysis has never fully resolved. The man was intelligent enough to understand that his action would not achieve his stated goal, and he did it anyway. The most honest interpretation is that by the time he reached the facility, the goal of disclosure had been replaced by the goal of being impossible to ignore, regardless of the consequences. His mutation path diverging from Birkin's precedent in the ways the document describes, retaining cognition longer, expressing more physical symmetry in the early stages, is consistent with the injection into healthy body variable that all subsequent research has identified as the primary factor distinguishing controlled from catastrophic G virus expression. His mind persisted through stages that had completely obliterated Birkin's cognitive access by the equivalent mutation phase, and the accounts of his behavior in the early post-injection period describe an individual in extreme physical distress who was nonetheless capable of goal-directed navigation and, briefly, verbal communication. He was still in there, fighting the virus for control of a body that the virus was systematically winning. The facility's destruction removed the physical evidence of his action, but not the documentation that had accumulated in the lead-up to it. The federal response team that arrived at the scene operated under the same classified recovery protocols that had governed the Raccoon City aftermath, and their first priority was the same: documentation, suppression, narrative control, witness management. They were efficient. They were also, by this point in the bioterror era's development, operating in an environment where suppression was becoming progressively more difficult, because the number of people with partial knowledge of the corporate history was growing faster than the institutions capable of managing them could process. Part 30. 9. Jake Muller's blood. Albert Wesker's biological legacy is the most operationally significant unintended consequence of the company's entire research program. More significant than the T virus outbreak in Raccoon City. More significant than the Loire Village hybridization work. More significant than anything that Birkin produced in Nest. It is more significant precisely because it was completely unplanned. Nobody at the company designed for Wesker to father a child. Nobody anticipated that the prototype virus he injected in the Arklay Mountains would interact with his reproductive biology in the specific way that it did. And nobody identified Jake Muller's existence as a strategic asset for more than a decade after his birth. The prototype virus that Wesker obtained from Birkin prior to the Arklay incident was not a completed product. It was an experimental strain that Birkin had developed as a proof of concept for his theory about host enhancement through viral integration, a theory that would eventually inform the G virus's adaptive architecture, but that at the time of Wesker's injection was still far from the controlled, staged mutation system that Nest would spend the next decade perfecting. The prototype integrated with Wesker's cellular structure in a way that was unprecedented, because Wesker was the first human subject it had ever been administered to in a living, conscious state. Every prior application had been to tissue cultures, animal models, or posthumous samples. The virus encountered a living, intelligent, high-functioning human nervous system and began the process of negotiating with it rather than overwriting it, a behavior that the prototype's designers had theorized was possible but had never actually observed. The result was a human being who retained his cognitive architecture completely, gained a suite of physical capabilities that the viral integration provided, and remained biologically reproductive in a way that the company's research had never modeled, because the company's research had never produced a stable viral integration in a living human host before. What the prototype did to Wesker's reproductive biology is the subject of classified research that was not completed before the files were scattered across the various successor entities' archives. The working hypothesis, based on the evidence available from Jake's biological profile, is that the viral integration altered the genetic material in Wesker's reproductive cells, incorporating modified sequences from the prototype virus into the germline. When Jake was conceived, he inherited not only Wesker's standard human genetic material, but a suite of novel sequences derived from the viral integration, sequences that his own immune system, developing in the absence of the full viral presence that had driven his father's enhancement, processed and incorporated into an antibody framework of extraordinary breadth and specificity. Jake was not immune to all pathogens, because his body destroyed them all equally. He was resistant to a specific class of engineered viral agents, those whose protein architectures derived, even distantly, from the progenitor lineage, because his immune system had been trained by his inherited genetic material to recognize and respond to progenitor-derived protein signatures with a speed and efficiency that normal adaptive immunity could never achieve. The C virus, the primary bioterror agent of the 2012 crisis, was a progenitor lineage derivative. His blood produced antibodies against it that were structurally complementary to the virus's attack proteins in a way that no synthesized compound had been able to replicate. He was, in the most precise technical sense, the product that Umbrella had spent 40 years trying to build. A human being whose biology had been permanently enhanced by viral integration without the loss of cognition, personality, or autonomous function. He was also a man who had grown up in desperate poverty in a country whose government had been destabilized by the same corporate forces whose biological weapons his blood could now neutralize, who had spent his adult life as a mercenary because it was the most reliable income available to someone with his skill set and his lack of institutional affiliation, and who had no knowledge of his father's identity or his own biological significance until he was already in the middle of the crisis that made both facts urgently relevant. The distance between what he was, in the technical, biological sense that the research programs cared about, and who he was, in the human sense that he cared about, was the central conflict of his involvement in the 2012 events, and it was not resolved to anyone's particular satisfaction. Part 40. Why the G virus was never perfected. The failure of every post-Birkin attempt to stabilize and advance the G virus is sometimes framed as a mystery, a testament to the irreplaceable nature of its creator's genius. But the actual explanation is more structural and less romantic than that framing suggests. The G virus was not unreplicable because Birkin was uniquely brilliant, though he was. It was unreplicable because its foundational architecture contained a dependence on variables that Birkin had built into it without fully recognizing that he was doing so. The genetic targeting system, the mechanism by which the virus identified compatible hosts, was calibrated against Birkin's own genome, not because he designed it that way, but because the virus assembled this system during the years of its development inside Nest, where the only living human being it had continuous access to for calibration purposes was Birkin himself. The virus learned what human DNA looked like by reading Birkin's. It learned what compatible genetic material looked like by comparing everything it encountered to Birkin's baseline. This calibration was not stored in a way that could be exported, copied, or transferred to a new host genome. It was embedded in the virus's own protein architecture through a process of continuous biological iteration that had taken 12 years to produce and that could not be compressed or replicated in any laboratory setting, because it required not just time, but the specific biological environment of a specific living person's body. Every research program that attempted to produce a G virus derivative with a functional reproductive targeting system encountered the same problem. The targeting system they built was either non-functional, producing random implantation attempts with the catastrophic rejection rates of non-compatible hosting, or it was calibrated to the genome of whatever host tissue they had used during the calibration phase, meaning it was only potentially compatible with direct biological relatives of the research subject, a pool of potential hosts that was self-limiting and practically useless for any scaled application. The asexual reproduction problem was not separate from this targeting failure. It was a consequence of it. The targeting system and the reproductive drive were not two independent mechanisms. They were a single integrated system in Birkin's original design, and the integration was what made each component function correctly. The targeting system modulated the reproductive drive, directing it toward compatible hosts and suppressing it in the presence of incompatible ones. Without the calibrated targeting system, the reproductive drive operated without modulation, continuously active, unable to assess compatibility, producing the catastrophic, non-compatible implantation failures that made G virus hosts uncontrollable and unpredictable in every research and field application after the original. The progressive cognitive erasure problem was similarly foundational. Birkin had believed, through most of the Nest development phase, that it was a calibration issue, that the rate of cognitive degradation could be controlled by adjusting the virus's mutation velocity parameters. He had been working on this adjustment in the final months before the USS Alpha Team's raid. His working notes from that period, partially recovered from the Nest facility's analog backup systems, describe a theoretical approach to slowing the virus's colonization of the host's neural tissue through a timed release inhibitor that would allow the mutation stages to proceed while preserving specific cognitive functions. He had not yet tested this approach. He died before he could. The inhibitor concept was reconstructed from his notes by 3 separate research programs over the following decade. All 3 concluded that the theoretical framework was sound. All 3 failed to produce a functional version of the compound for the same fundamental reason. The compound needed to interact with the G virus's neural colonization mechanism in a way that required precise biochemical knowledge of the virus's specific protein binding architecture in human neural tissue, and that knowledge had never been fully characterized, because the only human subject the virus had ever successfully integrated with, at the intended rate, Birkin himself, had died in the immediate post-injection period, before any controlled observation of the neural integration process was possible. Birkin had understood his own virus in a way that he had never fully externalized, because the understanding was partly intuitive, built from years of direct observation and an intellectual connection to the material that was, in the end, as personal as the calibration of the targeting system. He had made himself the virus's reference point in more ways than one. He was the only person who could have completed the work he had started. The city died because Spencer tried to take the work away from him. The work died because the virus took the man away from the world. Both losses were final. Neither had to happen. The entire trajectory of the bioterror era that followed was built on the wreckage of two decisions made in a single evening in September of 1998. Spencer's decision to send the USS team and Birkin's decision to pick up the syringe.